Hey, Pulse Nation, Richard Garner here, host of a Third Way podcast and regular contributor here at The Pulse on all things media. Filling in today for our fearless leader, Joe Martino, who is taking a well-deserved break. So rest up, Joe, because there's a lot to deal with when you get back, not the least of which, breaking news-ish, the US has finally crossed the Rubicon into the dystopian world of 1984. What? That sounds like hyperbole, Richard. It sounds like you're exaggerating. Well, I wish I was, but we now live at a time where there is such a thing called the Disinformation Governance Board, or as you might be calling it at home, the Ministry of Truth. Now, why should that terrify us? Well, they tell us to follow the science a lot. So I looked into a recent theory by none other than Nick Bostrom. You might say, who is Nick Bostrom? If you're familiar with holographic universe theory, the idea that we all live in a simulation, matrix style, you've heard that from, Silicon Valley stalwarts like Elon Musk and many others who are actually now of the belief that it's more likely than less likely that we are living in a simulation. That's perhaps a rabbit hole for another day. But why is this important? Well, when Elon Musk talks about holographic universe theory, he talks about Nick Bostrom. And he cites his work, this Oxford professor, as being the guy who really sort of introduced this idea scientifically to the world. Well, Nick Bostrom's got another theory, and it's called the Singleton Theory. What is that, you ask? Well, let me read it to you. In set theory, a singleton is a set with only one member. But as I introduced the notion, the term refers to a world order in which there is a single decision-making agency at the highest level. Among its powers would be the ability to prevent any threats, internal or external, to its own existence and supremacy, and have the ability to exert effective control over major features of its domain, including taxation and territorial allocation. Wow, that sounds like some sort of odd scientific description of a one-world government. What are you, crazy? What are you, a conspiracy theorist? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, this is the objective scientific breakdown from an Oxford professor of where he believes the eventuality of where we're going will lead, and in fact can only be the eventuality where we end up. Okay, well, let's take a look at this further. Again, up against the recent announcement of the Disinformation Governance Board. If you're not familiar with the book and then the movie 1984, written in 1949 by George Orwell, you're probably at least familiar with the term Orwellian. But if you haven't read the book, I strongly recommend going back and reading it. It'll take you a couple days, or cheat like I did in grade 9 English and watch the movie. Either way, you will be introduced to terms that we've talked about here on the Pulse before. Memory holding, which is, hey, that didn't happen because we didn't report it, therefore it doesn't exist. And of course, the Ministry of Truth. What is the Ministry of Truth, you ask? Well, let me read it, and you tell me if this sounds at all like the Disinformation Governance Board, or DGB. The Ministry of Truth is the Ministry of Propaganda. This is according to our friends at Wikipedia. As with the other ministries in the novel, the name Ministry of Truth is a misnomer because in reality, it serves the opposite purpose. It is responsible for any necessary falsification of historical events. However, like the other ministries, the name is also apt because it decides what is truth. As well as administering the truth, the ministry spreads a new language amongst the populace called newspeak, in which, for example, truth is understood to mean statements like 2 + 2 = 5. When the situation warrants it, in keeping with the concept of doublethink, another 1984 word that you should look up. The ministry is thus aptly named in that it manufactures / creates truth in the newspeak sense of the word. Well, that was crazy dystopian science fiction when it was written in 1949. And as it's been cited throughout history, often in hyperbolic terms where people would go right to, this is 1984, this is crazy. And at times I personally thought that sometimes that was an exaggerated notion. Well, the year 2022 has thrown us into the time machine back to 1984. We are here, ladies and gentlemen, because again, not only do we have a Disinformation Governance Board, we have somebody running it who is right now, I would say, the queen of doublespeak, the queen of newspeak. And of course, who better to head up the Ministry of Truth than somebody who could say this a few years ago in 2020 when asked about whether government should have the power to regulate and control speech, and then say what she's saying now. First, what she said in 2020.
Imagine that, with President Trump right now calling all of these news organizations that have inconvenient for him stories that they're getting out there, that he's calling fake news, and now lashing out at platforms. I would never want to see our executive branch have that sort of power. That's why, the legislative process with our duly elected officials is really important, that sort of consultative rulemaking process. And we can't just govern by executive order anymore.
Ironically, I would agree with the woman speaking in 2020, but of course she was speaking about a Trump administration. Therefore, she's super pro free speech and super anti-government controlling or regulating speech. And the problem when governments get into the business of regulating and controlling free speech, it becomes subjective up to their ultimate definition as to what qualifies as harassment, what qualifies as offensive, and what qualifies as criminal, worthy of censorship, worthy of being deleted, if you will. And there's many people out there who interpret today just criticism as harassment, as offensive, as unfair, as racist, as transphobic, as misogynistic. And unfortunately, Ms. Jankowicz wrote the book on that. The book is called How to Be a Woman Online, Surviving Abuse and Harassment and How to Fight Back. You are always going to have a small percentage of cranks, of idiots, of people who are disrespectful, who are racist, who are misogynistic, who are transphobic, who are just protected by the anonymity of social media and will say or do just about anything. But the good news is, as discerning adults, we have the ability to understand that that's just the makeup of the human species. There's always going to be a small percentage of that. Are we not adult enough to be able to handle that without absolutely trying to regulate and control everything everybody says? Well, that's obviously up to each person to decide. But personally, I believe we are. So in the end, as a 33-year-old author and so-called disinformation expert, qualified to run such a huge program, well, obviously, again, that's up for people to decide, but it feels like the type of position that you'd want somebody who's got more life experience, who really understands history and the sort of geopolitical world history, understanding how this has been implemented before in different countries, and would be able to understand the real sensitivity around this issue. Somebody who's credible, somebody who's authoritative, somebody who's objective, a serious person that we can all trust.
Rudy Giuliani shared bad intel from Ukraine. Or when TikTok influencers say COVID can cause pain. They're laundering disinfo and we really should take note and not support their lies with our wallet, voice or vote. Oh!
Wow. To each her own, I guess. So let's say she's not your cup of tea. Well, what about the Department of Homeland Security's head, Alejandro Mayorkas? He surely can articulate and communicate what this is all about, why it's important, and be able to reassure all of us that there's nothing to worry about here as far as an infringement of our rights on free speech and our civil liberties. And who better to find that out than CNN's Dana Bash?
Let's talk about a different topic, which is what you are calling, your department is calling the Disinformation Governance Board. You unveiled that this week. Republicans are calling it Orwellian and comparing it to the Ministry of Truth in the novel 1984. Can you clarify what exactly is this? What exactly will this Disinformation Governance Board do? Will it monitor American citizens?
Dan, I'm very pleased to do so. It's clear. I mean, those criticisms are precisely the opposite of what this small working group within the Department of Homeland Security will do. And I think we probably could have done a better job of communicating what it does and does not do. So the fact is that disinformation that creates a threat to the security of the homeland is our responsibility to address. And this department has been addressing it for years, throughout the years of the prior administration, and an ongoing basis. Disinformation from Russia,
right.
China,
we know
Iran.
The problems, but it's still not clear to me how this governance board will act. What will it do? So
what it does is it works to ensure that the way in which we address threats, the connectivity between threats and acts of violence are addressed without infringing on free speech, protecting civil rights and civil liberties, the right of privacy. And the board, this working group, internal working group, will draw from best practices and communicate those best practices to the operators, because the board does not have operational authority.
Will American citizens be monitored?
No.
Guarantee that.
Well, so what we do, we in the Department of Homeland Security don't monitor American citizens.
You don't, but will this board change that?
No. The board does not have any operational authority or capability. What it will do is gather together best practices in addressing the threat of disinformation from foreign state adversaries, from the cartels, and disseminate those best practices to the operators that have been executing in addressing this threat for years.
Well, kudos to Dana Bash for pushing back, because obviously she, like most of us, are unclear on exactly what the DGB is, what it's going to be doing, why it's been formed in the first place, and most importantly, whether we can trust the government to not then monitor our speech, track our speech, and ultimately infringe on our civil liberties. And of course, the Department of Homeland Security's head, Mayorkas, has reassured us we have nothing to worry about. Well, we've all seen this movie before: Q, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and of course, the myriad of times that we've been told that we're not being monitored by government and found out that we are. So should we be worried about the DGB? Well, the analogies around 1984, Orwellian, Big Brother is watching, Ministry of Truth, Newspeak, etc., I would say here are all valid. There have been times throughout history where I think people have cited it, maybe, in a sort of exaggerated way, but here we found ourselves at a time where there is literally an appointed government board in the United States that is going to be deciding what is misinformation and disinformation. And we've already seen in the last 2 years what happens when just private entities start to do that. People get deplatformed. Jankowicz herself tweeted that the Hunter Biden story was disinformation, that the lab leak was disinformation. Well, how did that work out? And that's in recent history. So why would we be rolling the dice with this type of opportunity to, again, get things wrong, censor people, deplatform people, cancel people, when really it's not necessary? We're all adults. But you might say, well, I don't live in the US, so I don't care. Okay, fair enough. Well, let's say you live in Canada. Well, you'd be familiar, possibly, or not, with Bill C-10. That's Canada's version of trying to monitor through the CRTC all things internet, all things podcast, all things media. So there was pushback on that. So they amended the bill. Now it's called Bill C-11. For the people who have been asking themselves, what can I do? What is the call to a mission, if you will? Well, I would say go first to your country, wherever you are, and see what type of bills might already be in process of being enacted around, regulating misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. and find out what they actually mean and where they are in terms of becoming law. Because once we cross that, I'm worried that we're going to have a very difficult time to get back. There was a great song back in the day by Gil Scott Heron. It was a protest song in the 70s called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." And even though the meaning was different at the time, I think the sensibility of it applies to where we're at today. We're dangerously close to living in an alternate world to whatever the mainstream world is, if these types of organizations, these departments to protect us from misinformation and disinformation, get to go forward without being challenged. So this is something that, again, I would strongly recommend that we all resist. Next week, I'll be back with a part 2 of the history of the pandemic prophet himself, Bill Gates, with way more context as to what the history of this particular person is, not just at Microsoft, but since they formed the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and how nefarious it is and how much we should be all responding to this guy being re-elevated back to the czar of pandemics and all things vaccines.